There are stories people tell to make themselves feel brave. This isn't one of them. I'm going to tell you about the winter the whole world turned to glass, the winter that took more men than any war I ever heard of, and how a hole in the side of a mountain, and the people who knew about it, kept a few of us breathing when by every right we should have been frozen stiff in our saddles. I've never told it straight before. I told pieces of it. I lied about the parts that made me look bad, and there are a lot of those parts. But I'm old now, and the men who could have called me a coward are mostly in the ground, and the woman who saved my worthless life deserves to be more than a thing I carry around quiet. So stay with me. I promise you it gets cold before it gets warm, and I promise you that's the whole point. The first thing that went was the dog. Not died, went, bolted. I was halfway up the draw with 40 head ahead of me and a wind coming down off the Mogollons that didn't sound like wind. It sounded like something grinding, and old Pike just stopped. Sat down in the snow with his ears pinned and looked back the way we'd come, and then he was gone. Didn't bark. Didn't whine. A dog that had worked cattle with me for 9 years turned and ran for lower ground and never looked at me once, and I remember thinking, in the dumb, slow way a man thinks when he doesn't yet understand he's already dead. Well now, that's not like him. I should have followed the dog. That's the first thing I'll tell you, and I'll probably tell you 12 more times before this is done, because it's the truest thing I know. The animals understood. We didn't. We had calendars and almanacs and the Silver City Enterprise telling us it'd be a mild one, and the animals had whatever it is they have, and the animals were right. Let me back up, because I keep a habit, kept it my whole life, of writing things down in a little log book I carry in my coat. Tallies mostly. Head of cattle, days of work, what I'm owed and by who. My wife used to say I'd tally my own funeral if I could hold the pencil. So when I say the temperature dropped 40 degrees in the span of an afternoon, I'm not guessing. I wrote it. I have the page. The ink got thick and slow toward the bottom because it was freezing in the bottle. It was the third week of what we'd later just call the freeze, like it was a person, like it had a name and a grudge. By then it had already done its worst work down in the valleys, froze the Gila solid enough to walk a wagon across, killed the Hutchins family in their own kitchen with the stove going full, snuffed out whole herds where they stood so that come spring you'd find them upright, leaning into each other like men telling secrets. But up where I was, chasing the last of my cattle that drifted in the early storms, I didn't know any of that yet. I just knew the dog was gone and the grinding wind was getting louder, and my fingers had stopped being fingers about an hour back and become something else, something I had to look at to make sure was still there. 40 head. I want to be honest about what I was doing up there because it matters to the rest. I was not a hero. I was a man who owed money to the bank in Silver City and could not afford to lose 40 head, and I went up after them against the advice of every living soul who loved me, which by that winter was a shorter list than it used to be. My wife was 2 years gone. My boy was with her sister in Tucson. I had a ranch I couldn't run alone, and a debt I couldn't pay, and 40 animals worth more than my pride. And so I rode up into the teeth of the thing because I was too stubborn and too broke to do the smart thing. Stubbornness. If you want to know the trait that defines me, that's the one. It's not a virtue. People will tell you it is, they'll dress it up and call it grit, call it backbone, but I've watched stubbornness put more men in the ground than whiskey and lead combined, and I include myself in the count of who it nearly buried. The horse went down in the draw. It wasn't dramatic. That's what nobody tells you about dying in the cold, it's got no drama to it. My horse, a good steady bay named Almanac, just put a foot wrong in a snow-buried hole, and I heard the leg, and then we were both in the drift and the world was very quiet and very white and very, very close. I lay there with the horse screaming. That part had drama, God, that part I still hear. And I knew I had to do the thing, and I did the thing, and I'm not going to describe it. There are mercies that look like cruelties, and that was one. After, the quiet came back. The snow kept on. The wind ground its teeth somewhere up the canyon. And I sat down next to my dead horse. and I made a decision that I have spent 40 years being ashamed of and grateful for in equal measure. I decided to stop. I'd heard about it. Every cattleman has the warm, easy sleep that comes for you in the deep cold. They say it doesn't hurt. They say toward the end you feel hot, that men have been found stripped half naked in the snow because the cold confuses the body into thinking it's burning. I felt that warmth start to come up through me like water filling a boot, slow and almost kind, and I thought about my boy in Tucson, and I thought about the debt I'd never pay now, and I thought, and this is the shameful part, I thought good. I thought finally, because I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. I'd been tired since the day we put my wife in the ground, and here was the cold offering to set the whole load down for me, and I let go of it. I let go. That's when the hand grabbed my collar. I want to describe her the way I saw her that first second, because the way I saw her was wrong, and the wrongness is part of the story. I saw an enemy. Understand what I was, what we all were in that country in those years. I'd grown up on the stories, the raids, the Apache wars, Geronimo's name spoken like a curse in every saloon from Lordsburg to Tucson. I'd never fought an Apache in my life. I'd never so much as spoken to one. But I had a head full of other men's hatred and other men's fear. And when a hand came out of the white and hauled me up out of the snow, the first thing my body did, my freezing, dying, traitor body, was reach for the pistol on my hip. My fingers didn't work. That's the only reason this story has a part 2. My fingers were dead clubs and they scrabbled at the pistol grip and couldn't close, and in the time it took me to fail at killing the person saving my life, I got a look at her face. She was older than me. 60 maybe, though the cold and the years make liars of faces. Her hair was iron gray and bound up under a wool cap that had certainly belonged to a white man before it belonged to her. She had a face like the country itself, lined, weathered, set hard against the weather, and her eyes, when they met mine and saw my hand going for the gun, did not change. That's what I remember most. She watched me try to kill her with the flat patience of a woman watching a child throw a tantrum. She'd seen it before. She'd see it again. It didn't frighten her and it didn't anger her. It just confirmed something she already knew about men like me. She said one word. I didn't have the language then. I learned a little of it after in the chamber in the long dark, but I learned later that the word she said meant something close to enough. Not a command exactly. More like the thing you say to a pot about to boil over. Enough. Then she slung my arm over her shoulders and started dragging me up the draw, and I, who had just decided to die, found I did not have it in me to refuse to live. That's the thing about the warm sleep. It's only kind until somebody offers you the other thing. The minute her hand was on my collar, I wanted to live so bad it shamed me, and I clawed at the snow with my dead hands and I tried to help her carry me, and she grunted at the dead weight of me and kept on. There were others. I want to be clear, it wasn't just her. I'd been so far gone I hadn't seen them, 3 more, 2 men and a younger woman, moving through the storm with a sureness that made me understand all at once how badly I'd misjudged the country. I'd been fighting the snow. They moved through it like it was an old argument they'd long since won. They had my saddle off the dead horse before I understood what they were doing. They had my rifle, my saddlebags, the wool blanket roll. They took everything that could keep a person alive and they took me, and I remember thinking through the freezing fog of my brain that they were thorough, that they were stripping me like the country stripped the cattle, and I was wrong about that too. They weren't taking my things. They were saving them for me, as it turned out, though I didn't deserve the assumption. We went up. I'll never be able to tell you the route. I was mostly unconscious, and even if I'd been clear-headed, I don't think I could have found it again, and I think that was the point of how it was hidden. We went up and then we went in, through a cleft in the rock so narrow I felt both shoulders scrape, into a dark that closed over us like deep water, and the wind cut off so sudden it was like a slammed door. And it was warm. I don't mean it was less cold. I mean warm. I mean the air had a softness to it, a wet living warmth like breath, and I started to shake. That's the body coming back. The violent shaking that means you're not dead yet, and somebody put a hand on my chest to steady me, and somebody else was forcing something hot between my lips. A broth that tasted of fat and herbs and smoke. And I drank it like an animal, and I wept like a child, and I could not have told you the difference between the two. I should tell you about the chamber, because you've waited this long and the title promised it, and a man should keep his promises even 40 years late. It was a cave, yes, but to call it a cave is to call a cathedral a pile of rocks. The Apache had a word for it I won't try to spell. It meant, more or less, the breathing place, the place where the mountain breathes. And that was exactly right, because deep in the back of it, past where the firelight reached, there were vents in the stone where warm air came up from somewhere far below, somewhere down in the bones of the earth. And it was that breath of the deep mountain that kept the whole place above freezing no matter what the sky was doing. They'd known about it for generations. The old woman, her name, I'd learn, was a word I'll write as Data's kin called her, but to me she became simply grandmother, because that's what the children there called her, and I had nowhere else to put the feeling grandmother told me later. In the slow, patient way, she told me everything, that her people had wintered in the breathing place when the bad cold came, the killing cold that came maybe once in a long lifetime. Her grandmother had brought her here as a girl. The location was not written down, was not spoken of to outsiders, was passed mouth to ear through the women of the band because, and she said this without any heat, just stating a fact about the world because the white men take everything they are shown, and a thing like this taken would kill the ones it was meant to save. I lay by that fire and I listened to her say that, and I thought about my dead hands reaching for my pistol, and I understood that she was right, and the understanding was the coldest thing I felt that whole winter. There were maybe 30 people in the breathing place when they brought me in, old folks and children mostly, and the handful of strong ones like grandmother's party who went out into the storm to bring back the ones who could be brought back. Because that was the thing I didn't understand at first, the thing that took me days to piece together through my broken understanding of their tongue and their gestures and their too patient faces. They were going out on purpose. They were going out into the killing cold, the cold that had stood whole herds up dead in the fields, and they were searching. Not for their own were already safe inside. They were searching for us, for the lost ones, for the stupid, stubborn, frozen white men who'd ridden up into the teeth of the thing against all good sense, the men whose grandfathers had hunted their grandfathers, the men who would reach for a pistol with a dead hand even as they were being saved. I asked grandmother why, once I had enough of the language to ask. It took me a long time to find the words and longer to work up the nerve. I asked her why they would risk themselves, and they did risk themselves. I'll tell you in part 2 about the one who didn't come back, why they would go out into that death after people who'd have shot them on a clear day in summer. She looked at me for a while. The fire popped. Somewhere in the dark a child was singing very quietly to itself, the way children do. And she said, "I'm giving you my best translation, the one I've carried 40 years, she said. The cold does not ask what you are, so we do not ask either. A frozen man is just a man. When the world is trying to kill everyone, the only people are the ones still trying to keep each other alive." I didn't have anything to say to that. I still don't. I've turned it over 10,000 times and I've never found the bottom of it. Here is what I have to tell you to end this first part, and it's the thing that's hard to write, the thing I lied about for 40 years. On my third day in the breathing place, when I could walk again, when my fingers had come back enough to hold a cup, I lost 2 of them to the frostbite, the smallest 2 on my left hand, but I kept the rest, which was more than I had any right to. On that third day, a storm of a different kind came to the mouth of the cave. Men, white men, 6 of them half frozen, found by grandmother's people the same as I'd been found, dragged in the same as I'd been dragged. And I knew them. Not friends, I had few of those left, but I knew their faces from Silver City. Hard men. The kind who talked loud in the saloon about what ought to be done to the Apache, what they'd do given half a chance, The kind of talk I'd nodded along to once because nodding was easier than the alternative. And one of them, thawing by the fire that was keeping him alive, looked around at the people who'd saved him, at grandmother, at the children, at the old ones. And I watched his face do the thing my face had done in the snow. I watched the fear and the hatred come up in him like the warm sleep had come up in me, slow and almost kind, offering him an easy place to set down the hard work of understanding. And he reached, with a hand that was just starting to work again, toward where they'd stacked our weapons. I was closer to the rifles than he was. I'd been watching them, old habit. A cattleman counts what's valuable, and a rifle in a strange camp is the most valuable thing there is. I could have reached them first. I could have let what was going to happen happen. I want you to sit with the fact that I thought about it. For one long second by that fire, with the mountain breathing warm around us and the children singing in the dark, and the woman who'd saved my life standing with her back to a man reaching for a gun, for one long second I waited. My whole life on one side, 30 strangers on the other. The arithmetic a stubborn, frightened, half-frozen man does when nobody's looking. I've never told anybody what I did next. I said the rifle, or I said the man. I've started this part a dozen times in my head, and it always begins with the wrong thing, so let me just put down what happened and let it be ugly. I didn't reach the rifle, I reached the man. I was on my feet before I decided to be. That's the only way I can describe it, that my body had already done the math my mind was still pretending to chew on, and I put myself between Birch and the weapons. His name was Birch. I'd remembered it the second I saw his face by the fire. A freighter, a loud man, a man who'd once stood up on a chair in the Centennial Saloon and given a speech about scalps that got him bought drinks for a week. And here he was on his knees on the floor of the breathing place, alive only because the people he'd talked about scalping had carried him in out of the dark, and his hand was working again just enough to be dangerous, and I stepped on it. I'll say that plainer. I put my boot down on the hand of a freezing man, on the floor of the cave that was saving both our lives, and I leaned my weight on it, and I felt the small bones of it grind under me, and I looked down into his face while he cursed me, and I said, God, I said it's so quiet. I've never been so quiet in my life. I said, don't. That was all, don't. The most useless word in the language and the only one I had. He looked up at me like I'd betrayed something, and I suppose to him I had. There's a brotherhood among men like Birch, a thing they mistake for loyalty, and by stepping on his hand I'd stepped outside of it, declared myself something other than what my skin had promised him I was. Traitor, his face said, though his mouth was busy with worse words. And the thing is, the thing I've never gotten around, he wasn't entirely wrong. I had betrayed something. I'd betrayed the version of myself that nodded along in saloons. I'd betrayed the man I'd been 3 days before, the one who reached for his own pistol with a dead hand. I just hadn't figured out yet what I'd traded him for. Grandmother watched the whole thing. She hadn't moved, while a man reached for a gun at her back and another man stamped on that man's hand. She'd stood by the fire with the same flat patience she'd watched me with in the snow, and I understood then that she'd seen this exact thing play out before, that there had been other winters, other Birches, other moments where the breathing place balanced on whether some saved fool would turn his rescue into a slaughter. She'd seen which way it went both ways. She wasn't going to stop it. She'd decided, a long time ago, and at a cost I couldn't imagine, that she would save men without controlling what they did after. That she'd carry us in out of the cold and then let us be whatever we were going to be, because to do otherwise, to only save the ones who'd be grateful, was to start asking the cold's own question. What are you? And she would not ask it. She would rather die than ask it. She as good as told me so. The other 5 men with Birch didn't move either. That was the hinge of the whole thing, and I didn't see it till later. They were watching to see what we did, the 2 white men, Birch and me, to see which of us the rest would follow. And when I stepped on his hand and said don't, and when Birch looked around for support and found 5 frozen men staring at the cave floor, something went out of him. The fight, maybe, or just the warmth of knowing the room was his. He pulled his hand out from under my boot and he cradled it, and he turned his face to the wall, and that was the end of it. No blood, no gunfire, just a loud man going quiet, and a cave full of people pretending very hard to be looking at something else, and an old woman feeding sticks to a fire like nothing in the world had happened. I went and sat down. My legs had finally caught up with the rest of me and they didn't want to hold me anymore. I got my logbook out. I don't know why, habit, the way another man might reach for a bottle, and I tried to write something down, and my hand was shaking too bad, and the two missing fingers on the left didn't help. And after a while, I just held the book and didn't write anything at all. Grandmother came and sat by me. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she nodded at the book and said a word I'd come to know, Naiji, near enough to counting, or the one who counts, and I understood she'd been watching me scratching it for 3 days and had made up her mind about what it was. I tried to explain. Cattle, debts, days of work. I didn't have the words and she didn't have my arithmetic, and somewhere in the middle of me failing to explain ledgers to a woman who'd spent her whole life keeping a different and better kind of account, she did a thing I wasn't ready for. She laughed. Not cruel, the opposite. A warm, creaking, surprised sort of laugh like she'd found something unexpectedly dear. You count cows, she said, or something like it, and the cold counts men, and you are still counting cows. And I started to laugh too, the awful shaking laugh of a man who's just learned he's still alive and doesn't know what to do with the information. And the two of us sat there by the fire laughing at the absurdity of my little book, while a half-frozen freighter sulked against the wall. And that, I want this on the record, that was the first time since my wife died that I laughed without it costing me something afterward. Now I have to tell you about Tolii. I've put it off long enough. He was one of the strong ones, one of grandmother's party, the younger of the two men who'd been there when they dug me out of the drift. I never learned the whole shape of who he was to the band, a grandson, I think, or a grandson by some bond closer than blood, the kind their families had that ours didn't have words for. He was maybe 25. He had a laugh that came easy and a bad knee that he favored when he thought nobody was looking. And he'd lost someone in the early storms, a wife or a sweetheart, I never knew which. And he carried it the way young men carry grief, which is to say loudly and then not at all and then loudly again, with no warning in between. I liked him. I'll just say it. In the days I spent in the breathing place getting my body back, Tolii was the one who tried hardest to bridge the gap between us, taught me words, laughed at my mouth mangling them, showed me how the vents in the back of the cave worked, how you could hold your hand over the stone and feel the mountain's breath come up warm and steady from the deep dark below. He showed me the place at the very back where the air came up strongest, where it was almost hot, where the old folks slept because their blood ran thin. He was proud of the place. You could see it. It was his to be proud of in a way nothing had ever been mine. On my 5th day, the wind outside changed. I'd learned to read it a little by then. Everyone in the chamber could read it. It was the only weather there was, and even I could tell that something worse was coming, a deeper cold riding in on the back of the cold we already had. And that was when one of the lookouts, a girl of maybe 14 who sat near the cleft and watched the white world for shapes, called out that there were shapes, people, out in it, coming up the draw or trying to, 3 of them moving wrong, moving like the cold already had them. I watched grandmother and Tolii and the other man, Klee, the older one, have a conversation I couldn't follow, fast and low. I caught enough. The new cold was nearly on them. To go out now into the throat of the worst of it after strangers who might already be past saving, it was a bad bet. It was maybe a fatal one. Klee was against it. I could see that even without the words, he kept pointing at the cleft, at the sky beyond it, at the children. Not worth it. Not this time. We have our own to keep alive. And Tolii looked at the children Klee was pointing to, and he looked at the dark cleft, and he looked, I swear he looked at me. The white man stamped on the floor 3 days before, the proof that you couldn't always know in advance who was worth the cold, and he made the kind of decision that I have never in my life been brave enough to make. He went. Just him and Clee in the end because somebody had to stay strong inside for the children, and because grandmother's body wasn't what it had been, though she fought them on it, she fought them hard. I remember her gripping Toliai's arm at the cleft. I remember he said something to her, soft, and pressed his forehead to hers for just a second, and then the dark of the passage took the two of them and the wind slammed its door. I should have gone. I want you to understand that I knew it even then, standing there with my body finally working again, my hands almost whole, a grown man who'd herded cattle through weather that had killed lesser men. I was strong enough to go. I was strong enough to be a fourth hand out there in the dark, to drag a frozen stranger the way I'd been dragged. And I did not go. I stood at the back of the chamber where the mountain breathed warm, and I let two of them walk out into the killing cold after three people I'd never met. And I told myself it was because I didn't know the country. I'd only slow them down. I'd be another body to save. And every word of that was true, and every word of it was a coward's true. The kind of truth you reach for the way I'd reach for my pistol. The kind that's just fear wearing better clothes. Stubbornness keeps a man alive in the cold. I told you that. What I didn't tell you is the other half. It also keeps him standing safe at the back of the cave, while braver people die for strangers, and it'll have a fine true reason ready every single time. Clee came back. He came back alone near morning with two of the three strangers, an old man and a boy, a grandfather and grandson it turned out, the third one already gone before they'd reached them, left in the snow because you cannot carry the dead and save the living both. And that is another of the cold's questions that I will let you sit with the way I've had to. Clee came through the cleft carrying the boy and dragging the old man and his face, Clee's face, that I'd thought of as the hard one, the practical one, the one who'd argued against going. His face was a thing I will not describe because it is not mine to describe. He looked at grandmother. He didn't have to say it. Toliai had found the strangers. Toliai had gotten them moving. And on the way back, with the new cold full upon them and the boy failing, Toliai had given the boy his coat, the good wool coat, the white man's coat that the breathing place could not spare and could not replace, and he had carried the boy the last stretch with his own chest bare to the worst night that country had seen in 100 years. He made it to within sight of the cleft. Clee said he could see the dark of the opening, could have called out and been heard, and there, close enough to live. With the warm breath of the mountain practically on his face, Toliai sat down in the snow. You understand. You've been with me since the drift. You know exactly what sitting down meant. He sat down the way I'd sat down beside my dead horse, except I sat down out of grief and exhaustion and a wish to be done. And Toliai sat down because he had spent every degree of warmth in his body keeping a stranger's grandson alive, and there was simply nothing left to stand up with. He told Clee to take the boy in. Clee said he tried to lift them both. He could not lift them both. Toliai told him, and Clee gave us the words exactly. In a voice I never want to hear again, Toliai told him, 2 now, come back for 1. And Clee carried the boy in because the boy could still be saved and Toliai had made it an order and there was no time to argue with a dying man you loved. And he went back out. Of course he went back out. He went back out as fast as a man can move through that, and it was not fast enough. It was never going to be fast enough. And when he reached the place where Toliai had been sitting, the new cold had already done what the new cold does, and Toliai was not there anymore. Not really. The thing in the snow was wearing his face, but the warm, easy laugh and the favored knee and the grief he carried in waves. All of that had gone up like breath into the killing dark, given away, spent, traded for the life of a boy whose name Toliai never even learned. The boy lived. I want that down clear because it matters and because Toliai would have wanted it down before anything else about himself. The boy lived. He's likely a grandfather now somewhere, telling some version of this to children who think it's a story people tell to feel brave. It is not that. I keep saying it is not that. We brought Toliai in the next day, when the cold eased just enough. It took 4 of us. I was one of the 4, I insisted, and nobody argued, and I think they let me carry him partly out of kindness, because they could see what was happening to me, and they were better people than I'd ever been, and they understood that a man who would not go out for the living might at least be allowed to carry in the dead. He weighed nothing, that's what undid me. This young man with his easy laugh, this person who'd spent his last warmth on a stranger, weighed nothing at all in my arms, and I carried him through the cleft into the warm, breathing dark, and I laid him down where they showed me. And then I went to the very back of the chamber, to the vents where the mountain breathed hottest, where Tolei had stood proud and shown me the warm stone with his living hand. And I put my own hand against the rock, and I felt the deep warmth come up steady and indifferent and eternal, the same warmth that could have saved him if he'd let it, the warmth he'd walked away from to carry a boy, and I broke. I haven't told you much about crying in this story, and there's been cause for it, and I've kept it back, because a man of my time and place didn't, because even now the words come hard. But I broke against that warm stone like the spring breakup on a frozen river, all at once and with a sound, and grandmother let me. She didn't comfort me. There are griefs that comfort insults, and she knew that better than anyone alive. She just stayed near, the way she'd stayed near Birch and the gun, a steady presence keeping watch over a thing that had to be allowed to happen. And after a long while, after I was emptied out, after the worst of it had passed up into the dark like everything else passed up into the dark in that place, she said one thing. She said, "Now you know what the warm place costs." And I thought she meant Tolei, the price of him, and she did mean that. But I've had 40 years to understand she meant more. She meant the whole arrangement. She meant that the breathing place had never been free, not once in all the generations her people had carried its secret. That every winter it kept some alive, someone walked out into the cold to find them, and not all of those someones walked back in. That the warmth at the heart of the mountain was paid for, over and over, in the bodies of the ones brave enough to go out after strangers. That I had been carried in on that price the same as Birch, the same as the boy, and that I had stood safe at the back and let the bill come due in another man's name. I have spent my life trying to be worth it. I want to tell you I have, and I can't, and that's most of what part 3 is about. There's one more thing I have to tell you before the end, and it's about what was waiting outside the cleft when the cold finally broke, and what I had to choose, and the man I have been ever since because of it. But I find I can't write it tonight. The cold broke on the 11th day. I know it was the 11th because I'd started counting again, not cattle, not debts, just days, just sunrises I had no business seeing. I'd scratch a mark in the logbook each morning when the lookout girl said the light at the cleft had changed. 11 marks. And on the morning of the 11th, the change in the light was different from all the others, and the lookout didn't call it out the way she usually did. She went very still. And then she said a word that ran through the whole breathing place like a current through water, and everyone who could stand went toward the cleft, and I went with them, and we stepped out one at a time into a world I did not recognize. The sun was out. That's the simplest way to say it and the least true. The sun was out, and it had turned the whole frozen country to fire. Every branch, every blade of grass, every fence wire for miles was sheathed in ice, and the low winter sun came across all of it at once and set it blazing, a white country burning cold, so bright it hurt, so beautiful it felt like an accusation. I stood there with my ruined left hand shading my eyes, and I thought, the world that killed everyone is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. I've never resolved that. I don't think it resolves. We weren't the only ones coming out into it. That was the thing nobody was ready for. All across that high country, in caves and root cellars and the lee of frozen rock, the survivors were crawling out into the light, the lucky, the saved, the ones who'd found a warm place or had one found for them. And you could see them far off, dark figures standing up out of the white the way we were standing up, all of us blinking at the burning world like the first or the last people on earth. And between us and them, scattered across the shining country, were the ones who hadn't found a warm place. I won't count those for you. I counted them at the time. God help me, old habit, and I'm not going to put the number down. Some accounts shouldn't be kept. And that's when I saw the riders. There were 4 of them, coming up from the valley along the only line a horse could take, and even at that distance I knew what they were. You learned the shape of organized men. Soldiers, or men with a soldier's bearing, a small patrol out from the fort, sent up to see who'd lived and who hadn't, the way they always came around after a disaster to take their tally the same as I took mine. And I felt the people around me go quiet and tight in a way I'd learned to read by then, and I understood the arithmetic of the moment before anyone said a word. The breathing place was a secret. The secret was the thing that kept it able to save people, because a thing like that known would be taken. Grandmother had told me so on my first night, calm as statting the weather. And here came 4 armed men of the kind that took things, riding straight up toward a cleft in the rock that 30 Apache had just walked out of in plain view of the whole shining valley. If the soldiers saw where we'd come from, if they understood what it was, if they marked the place and carried it back down to the fort and the freight road and the saloons full of men like Birch. I felt the whole weight of it settle on me, and I understood with a sick lurch exactly why it had settled there. Because I was the one who could talk to them. I was the white man. I was the one whose word the soldiers would take, the one who could ride down and meet them and tell them a story, any story, and be believed, because my skin was a kind of credential and theirs was a kind of crime, and the foulness of that was the truest thing about my whole country, and I was about to use it. Grandmother knew. Of course she knew. She'd known before I did. She came and stood beside me and looked down at the riders, and she didn't ask me to do anything. She never once in all our days asked me for a single thing. She just stood there, having saved my life and shown me the warm heart of her mountain, and let me carry her grandson's body in out of the snow, and she waited to see what I was. The same way she'd waited in the drift while I clawed for my pistol, the same way she'd waited while Birch reached for the rifle. She would not ask the cold's question. She would not even ask it of me now, when the asking might have saved everything. She would only watch. Here is the choice, and here is the thing I have never told a living soul. I could ride down and lie. Send the soldiers wide, tell them the survivors up here were my own outfit, holed up in a lined shack, nothing to see, move along. Protect the secret. Pay back in the only coin I had, some fraction of what I'd been given. It was the right thing, and I knew it was the right thing, and there was a part of me, the old part, the saloon-nodding part, the part that had stamped on Birch's hand and called it virtue, that did not want to do it. Because to ride down and lie for them was to declare myself, finally and out loud and in front of armed white men, as something other than what my skin had promised. It was to step outside the brotherhood for good, in daylight, where it counted. Birch had looked at me like a traitor in the dark of the cave where it cost nothing. Out here it would cost everything I had left in that country, my standing, my name. What little credit a broke widower rancher had left at the bank and the church and the bar. I want to tell you I didn't hesitate. I told that lie for 40 years. The version I told, when I told any of it, had me galloping down the slope without a second thought, the noble white man, the one good one, riding to the rescue. People liked that version. It let them off something. The truth is I stood there long enough for grandmother to see me stand there. Long enough for her to watch the whole war of it cross my face. Long enough that when I finally went for my horse, they'd given me a horse, one of theirs, because mine was a heap of bones up the draw, they'd given me a horse. When I finally swung up onto it, the moment had a shame welded into it that no good deed afterward could ever burn off. I did the right thing. And I did it slow, and I did it last, and I did it only after a dying part of me had argued the other way. And a man does not get to keep the clean version of a thing he had to drag himself toward. I rode down. I met the patrol a mile below the cleft, out where they couldn't see the rock. I gave them my name, which they knew, Silver City's a small world, and I told them I'd lost my horse and my cattle and very nearly my life, which was true, and that I'd waited the worst of it out in a cave with some others, and we were all of us coming down now, slow, half froze but alive. All true. I never lied. That's the one thing I'll let myself keep. I didn't have to lie. I just left out the only part that mattered, and I pointed them down the easy way toward the valley where the real survivors needed counting, and I rode with them a stretch to make it natural, and I never once looked back up the slope toward the cleft, because I knew if I looked they'd follow my eyes. The hardest thing I ever did was not turn my head. When I'd taken them far enough, when the rock was well behind us and the patrol had turned its mind to the dead in the valley, I made some excuse and I let them ride on. And then I sat my borrowed horse alone in the burning white country, and I looked back at last, and the cleft was just rock among rock, invisible, secret, safe. You truly could not find it if you didn't already know, and there was no one standing at it anymore. They'd gone back in, or moved on, or melted into the country the way they did. I never saw grandmother again. That's near the end, but not quite. I've made it sound like I rode off and that was that, and that's not how it went, and I won't cheat you now after you've come this far. I went back up. Not that day I had soldiers to lose and a part to play. But 2 days later, when the thaw had truly set in and the country was running with meltwater and the dead were being gathered in the valley, I rode the borrowed horse back up the draw to return it, and to, I don't know what, to say something, to find the words I'd never had. To carry something in, the way I should have carried myself out into the cold when Tolly I went. They were gone. The breathing place was empty, cold, even without their fires, without the press of 30 living bodies. The deep warmth of the mountain was a small thing, just a faint heat off the stone at the very back if you held your hand there and waited. I held my hand there a long time. I sat in the dark where I'd wept against the rock, where I'd laughed about my cow counting, where a man had been laid out who weighed nothing at all, and I understood they'd done what they always did when the cold broke and the soldiers came. They'd vanished, folded the secret back up and carried it away in the only place it was ever safe, which was inside the women of the band, mouth to ear, down the years, toward the next killing winter and the next stupid, stubborn, frozen fool who'd reach for his pistol with a dead hand and be saved anyway. I left the horse, tied it loose where they'd find it if they came back, with my good saddle on it, which was worth more than I could afford to give and not a fraction of what I owed. And I left my log book. I want that down, because it's the one decent, uncalculated thing I think I ever did. I tore out the pages of marks and debts and cattle, the counting, the naji, the small, mean arithmetic of my old life, and I left the book itself there on the warm stone at the back, empty, blank, for whoever came next. I don't know why. I think I wanted there to be a different kind of account kept in that place than the kind I'd kept my whole life. I think I wanted to leave behind the thing she'd laughed at, on the chance that the laugh had been the truest conversation I ever had. I'm old now, I told you that at the start. The country's all fenced and the railroads run where the draws used to be, and there are towns with electric lights in places I once rode for a day without seeing a soul. The freeze is a thing in the almanacs now, a record, a number, the great cold of that year, and the men who lived through it are mostly gone, and the ones who didn't are a name on a stone or not even that. My boy grew up and had boys of his own, and they think their grandfather is a sweet, confused old man who keeps a fire too high in the spring, who can't stand to be cold, who sits sometimes with his ruined left hand pressed flat against the warm stones of the hearth and won't say what he's thinking. I never told them the right version. I told them the brave one, the one where the noble rancher saves the Indians from the soldiers and rides off clean. They liked it. It let them off something. I'm telling you the other one now, the slow one, the one where I stamped on a man's hand and stayed safe at the back of the cave, while a better man froze and dragged myself toward the right thing only at the very last, and never even got to say the word don't. No, not don't. Never got to say thank you to the woman who waited in the snow to see what I was. Because here is what I've carried 40 years, the thing under all the rest. She never found out what I was. I rode down and I did the right thing and she went back into the mountain and we never met again. And so the last she ever saw of me was a man standing at the cleft, hesitating, with the whole war of it on his face. A man she could not have known would finally choose right, because she'd watched me choose wrong before and she did not flatter herself or me with assumptions. She saved my life without ever learning whether I was worth saving. She did it anyway. That was the whole of her, that anyway. And I have spent every cold morning since trying to be the man she had no reason to believe I'd be. I don't know if I've managed it. You can't keep that kind of account. I tried my whole life to count it the way I counted everything, and it doesn't tally, it never balances. The cold takes more than you can ever put back and the warm place costs more than you can ever pay. All you can do is what they did. Go out into it after whoever's lost. Don't ask what they are. Carry them in if you can and lay them down gentle if you can't. And don't expect to be thanked. And don't expect to be clean. And hold your hand against the warm stone when the grief comes up and let it come. The boy lived. I keep coming back to that. Somewhere there's an old man who doesn't know my name, who never knew Tolly Eyes, who is alive because a young Apache he'd never met gave away his coat and then his warmth, and then everything in a killing dark for a stranger. I think about him on the cold mornings. I press my hand to the stones. And I wonder if his grandchildren ask him where he learned to keep a fire so high.